So, a very, very warm welcome as we start our session two in the post lunch session of Samagam 2022. But before I proceed any further, I request my colleagues in the backend team to play that inspiring audio visual that we've seen twice since the morning. So when we played this particular video in the morning, and of course, I repeat myself, it was real goosebump moments. This was so inspiring, and there is a point in the video when it sort of all comes together. So just wanted to mention that for all of you. I extend a very hearty and a very warm welcome to all our esteemed panelists. This very important session post lunch. And of course, special welcome for Mr. Shashank Rastogi, who's the Principal India Rural Prosperity Lead at Bridgespan Group India. Shashank is going to be the moderator for this particular session. But before I hand over to Shashank, a brief about Samagam. And again, please excuse me. There are some of you who have been here since the morning. There are many of you here also from the organizing teams. But for those of you who are joining us now post lunch, just a quick rundown on what Samagam is all about. So Samagam, and in fact today's session, is dedicated to the spirit of partnerships and winning coalitions for achieving nothing else but our sustainable development goals. Since the morning, we started at 10 o'clock. We are meeting again after lunch. We had the inauguration and the context setting, followed by three very inspiring keynote addresses from Ms. Shoko Noda, who's a UNDP resident representative in India, Mr. S.M. Vijayanand, IAS, retired former Chief Secretary, Kerala Government, and Mr. Rakesh Ranjan, who's Mission Director, Aspirational District Program of the Niti Aayog. We've also had the first session after that, where we discussed about challenges for CSOs. So as I said, this entire theme of Samagam 2022, and I must also mention that there have been three Samagams earlier. Samagam 2018 was the first Samagam, which was essentially conceived and brought by Pradhan. So 2018, then Samagam 2020. Very happy and very glad to share with you that then there were four regional Samagams in the end of 2021. And finally, we are here at Samagam 2022. So this brief journey of the last 4 years, Samagam 2018 began with Pradhan, but Samagam 2022 has been conceptualized, is being brought together by 10 organizations. So 10 of us are coming together in one way or the other in bringing Samagam 2022 to fruition. And this is yet another example, a perfect example of collaboration. So I think enough of that, or enough of that context setting, background setting. I hand over to my very able colleague Shashank. But before that, a brief introduction of Shashank. So Shashank Rastogi is a principal, as I said, in the Bridgespan groups. Uh, uh, and at Bridgespan, Shashank leads the Rural Prosperity Vertical in India and is co-leading what is called the Pay What It Takes Initiative, PWIT. And PWIT initiative is a multi-stakeholder collaboration to drive mindset and practice change to foster a partnership-driven approach between NGO and funders. Its objective is to develop a stronger and more robust social sector in our country, delivering even greater impact. Shashank has also led the design and implementation of multi stakeholder collaborative focused on tribal healthcare. So, this entire conversation on government, business, and civil society, जिसे हम हिंदी में सरकार, समाज और बाजार कहते हैं, तो इन्हीं शब्दों के साथ में शशांक पुनः आपका स्वागत है एंड द स्टेज एंड प्लेटफॉर्म इज ऑल योर्स.
Thank you. Thanks, Anup, and a warm welcome to all the audience members as well. Thank you for making time for this, and all of us hope that this will be useful for, it'll be worth your time. The focus, as Anup said, we have talked about different kinds of collaboration and partnerships. And in this session, what we'll be focusing on is collaboration where funders are a key constituent as well. At Bridgespan Group, we have a strong belief that collaborations lead to better impact, greater impact, and can help solve the society's problems faster. And that's where we come from. Kashyap, my colleague, who will just share some of our research over the last 3 years about collaboratives in India, has been one of the key proponents of collaboration, and he has been spending extensive time learning from the collaboratives in India and sharing the learning with the sector. So the way we'll structure it is Kashyap will help us set the context about our conversation, where we'll bring in our esteemed panelists who have years of experience of managing, running these collaboratives, of being partners in such collaboratives, and working with such collaboratives. So with that, Kashyap, uh, and to give an introduction to Kashyap, Kashyap is also principal at Bridgespan Group. He leads the education vertical, as well as he leads the Bridgespan non-profit development program, which is a cohort-based capacity building program for non-profit teams, where Bridgespan teams work closely with the leadership teams, and anything between 3 to 5 people working from the non-profit teams to help develop specific areas of where non-profits require help. With that, Kashyap, I'll request you to share some of your findings with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Shashank. Thanks for the kind introduction. I think today I face two challenges. First up, I think one is that I am between you and the esteemed panelist. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is I'm doing this post lunch immediately. So I'll try and make it interesting for everyone and try and be brief as well, because I think it will have a lot of merit to hear from the horse's mouth, that is the panelists who are coming next, and to give them more time. So I'll be mindful of that as well. And with that, let me just share my screen and get us started. So I hope the screen is visible to everyone. And if not, please do tell me. I can just see the screen on my computer, so I'm not able to see any one of you. So please feel free to stop me in case you're not able to hear me, or in case you're not able to see the full screen. So with that, today we will focus on three key aspects. One, I think, an existential question of why do organizations or people collaborate, right? And if they do, then what are the key goals and roles that they play? And a lot of this is based on the study that Bridgespan did on philanthropic collaboratives in India. You can refer the entire report on our website. The study was done with support of Gates Foundation. And I think it was very timely because when we started the study, it was quite a nascent segment, and maybe it is still nascent, but this was pre-pandemic. And I think after COVID, the pace of collaboratives and collaboration just accelerated. So in a way, we got the timing quite right, and we are seeing. From when we started, we saw some green shoots. Now we are seeing a thriving environment of collaboratives, right? So coming back, we will first focus on the why of collaboratives. We will then quickly move to what have been some of the learnings from collaboratives, right? What are the key challenges which are faced by collaboratives as we heard them from different organizations who have been part of these collaboratives. And third are some recent trends that we have seen, especially vis-a-vis COVID and collaboratives, that I would love to share with all of you. So with that, I think first, what's the headline? The headline is that the problems in India are complex and large. I think the introduction video that we saw underlines it, so I need not say anything more. And I think there is a realization amongst all the social stakeholders that we can't solve it individually or just as an organization. There is a need for us to come together. I'm not saying this realization is new. I think the realization has been there. The forms to collaborate have changed over a period of time. And now there is a spectrum in which people and organizations collaborate, right? So we see a lot of informal collaboratives. At the same time, the other end of the spectrum is formal collaboratives where people come together with an aligned agenda and form an entity around it as well. So we are seeing a spectrum of collaboratives coming to fore. Another unique aspect that we saw in India, especially when we talk of collaboratives, in India, most of the collaboratives are multi-stakeholder collaboratives, which in simple terms means that it's not just funders coming together, but it's funders, the government, the non-profits, the intermediaries, the implementing organization, all of them are coming together to form a collaborative. Now, this is interesting also because if you, let's say, see something like in US, most of the collaboratives are funder collaboratives, where it's largely funders who are part of the collaboratives. Here, the group is more diverse, which means more diverse skill sets, but it also means need for more alignment as well. Moving forward, this question of why people collaborate, right? So I think it stems definitely from the fact that the problems are large and complex, but largely it boils down to three key things. I think the first key thing that we realize, and the numbers that you see are the numbers from the survey that we did with all the respondents who are part of collaborative. I think first and foremost is that collaboration helps them to leverage diverse skill sets and experiences of different partners, which is quite intuitive. Second is that it helps them expand their circle of influence and impact. I think it's dawned upon many organizations that their impact, however big they can be, will always be limited compared to the collective impact and collective influence. And I think that has come across quite prominently in our survey as well. And third is to mitigate risk as well, where a lot of people feel that individually they might be exposed to more risk, whether it's political, economical, or others, whereas collectively it helps them to mitigate that risk as well. So these are the three key reasons that people or partners cite for starting or being part of a collaborative. Very quickly, we'll move on to the goals of collaborative, right? And there is more to it in the paper or on our website, or the research paper on our website. But very quickly, we saw three primary goals for collaboratives being formed. One was in terms of scaling solution, wherein simply stated to achieve higher population level change than what they are able to do individually. Second was to help build a field where they felt that we could do more good by supporting other actors in the ecosystem rather than doing grassroots work ourselves. And third was very interesting and unique, wherein we saw that there are some collaborators which are actually formed to test different innovation, and if successful, they kind of socialize those innovations with others to take it up, and they themselves move on to something else. So that was the primary goal of these kind of organizations or collaboratives rather. In terms of role, we saw an entire spectrum of roles being performed by collaboratives, right from upstream in terms of informing public policy to downstream in terms of implementing programs. We saw a lot of prominence actually around two key roles. One was to develop and disseminate knowledge, and second was to facilitate implementation. So you see, even those spaces look very crowded on this slide, and that was a prominent roles played by the collaboratives. Post pandemic, however, we saw mobilizing and channeling funding also become quite prominent, and maybe rightly so, right? Because the need of the hour was to mobilize resources, and lot many collaborators started doing that. It should also be noted that the collaborators play multiple roles as well. So you might see some of the collaboratives here disseminating knowledge as well as mobilizing funding, or someone facilitating implementation as well as disseminating knowledge, and so on and so forth. So that was in terms of the why of collaborative and overview about the goals and the roles. Now let's quickly move on to the learnings from philanthropic collaboratives, right? When we were trying to talk to many stakeholders, there were varied and diverse learnings. And actually, on reflection, we realized that actually the learnings and the challenges vary based on the life stage of a collaborative. And this led us to think of a life cycle of a collaborative at three stages. One was coming together stage, where the collaborative is coming together, they are thinking about their vision, their strategy, and what are the governance mechanism. So this phase generally lasts for 0 to 2 years approximately. It can vary from collaborative to collaborative, but that what we called as a coming together phase. Then there was a phase where you start executing on the strategy and on the vision, and where the operating model gets tested, when you start tracking results and impact data, which we call as a working together stage. And this stage lasts from 2 years and beyond, right? It can be 10 years, 15 years, or less than that as well. And the third stage was a stage of reinvention or exit as well. We saw some collaborators who actually started off as collaboratives, reached a working together stage, and then actually exited from a collaborative model. Or we saw some which reinvented themselves, pivoted to something else, but continued to remain a collaborative. So that marks the third stage of a collaborative. So now if we look at the stages, there were some key challenges or learnings which emerged at each of these stages. I think in the coming together stage, the three key challenges which came, one was that initially when partners come together, there was definitely some amount of trust deficit, which sometimes results in excessive control over the workings of a collaborative. So that is something that one observed quite a lot. Second was the because it's a collaborative, there are many partners involved. The coming together itself take a year or two. That means that effectively you have to look for long-term funding, which will last you for 3-4 years at least, where you can have time to create your vision, strategy, and then start executing it. And therefore, getting long-term funding was again a key challenge. And third, which was quite prominent again, was the clarity or the lack of clarity thereof in roles and responsibility of multiple partners. Likewise, in working together, I think the challenges of coming together remained, but became very incremental in nature. The other challenges popped up, and that was when they started executing their strategy, there was a bit of a siloed approach by partners. The partners were trying to balance their priority as an organization vis-a-vis the collaborative's priority. The problem of long-term funding actually converted into the problem of getting unrestricted money, where you can build the organization, invest in capacity building. That came as a key issue. And third was, of course, the issue of demonstrating and quantifying impact. Now here, whatever you see as stars which are marked, stars are something which are problems which are unique to a collaborative. For example, the problem of demonstrating and quantifying impact is something that can be faced by any non-profit, whereas a problem of lack of trust or a siloed approach is largely when you are working as a collaborative, right? The third stage, I think, was largely trying to manage disruption and an inability to adopt those disruption. In case some organizations are pivoting, then again the issue of finding anchor partners came to the fore as well. So while we are discussing this problem, maybe I'm painting a cynical view here, but in a way it's realistic to say that when one collaborates, there are issues, and it's not easy to collaborate. However, what we realize is the benefits of collaborating outweigh the cost. And that was something very consistent in our finding when we spoke across the spectrum, across people who collaborated, and even when we spoke to people who have not collaborated so far, right? In terms of what we also were able to gather was promising practices for each of these challenges. So if you are thinking, oh, you're talking just about the challenges, but what about the answers? The research report has the answers as well in terms of promising practices. I will not go into all of that due to the time on hand, but I will just talk about the 3 C's which were most important, or as an antidote to some of these challenges. And I think the 3 C's were: one was in terms of commitment. There is a need for all partners to commit when they're coming into a collaborative. Second was in terms of clarity of roles and consistency of communication, to constantly communicate and ensure all partners are aligned. The third was the ability to course correct, because there might be multiple disruptions across, and as a collaborative, you need to get people along and also course correct if need be. So those were the 3 C's that we thought that at a philosophical level made a lot of sense to run an effective collaborative. To quickly end, I would quickly end on some of the themes that we are seeing post the pandemic or during the pandemic. I think as one is the increase in number of collaboratives in the last 2 years has been substantial in India. In fact, most of the collaboratives which were formed in the last 2 years, they have reached the working together stage far more quickly than even the 0 to 2 years that I quoted. And maybe the urgent need of that time was the catalyst. Lot of collaboratives, as I mentioned, are moving towards mobilizing funding as a role, and that has got disproportionate focus. The fourth point is that a lot of collaboratives have increased the quantum of funding and have become quite ambitious about it. Over the last year and a half, we have seen at least 3 to 5 collaboratives which are targeting a funding size of 100 crore and beyond, which is quite good considering the Indian landscape, right? And last but not the least is now collaboratives, after stabilizing, I think they are trying out new or non-traditional funding mechanisms. Like we have seen collaboratives which are working on returnable grant basis. Some are using blended finance instruments. So now we are seeing that innovation also come through as well. So with that, hope you got a context of the collaborative landscape in India. And with that, I will hand it back to Shashank.
Thanks, Kashyap. Thanks for setting the context and giving us a realistic picture that collaboratives are not a bed of roses, but maybe a thorny path towards a much better future. So I think a lot of us who are on this call as audience, as speakers, the fact that you chose this sector shares that you have already chosen a thorny path for a better future. So I think it's good that we are talking about further improving the future and better development. With that, I'll move into the panel discussion. And in terms of the structure of the panel for the audience, what we'll do is we'll spend around 55 minutes with the panelists, and then you can share your questions over chat, and we'll ask those questions to the panelists at the end of the session after the panel discussion is done. Uh, I hope that through the panel discussion, through the experience of our panelists, what all of us will be able to take back is how to mitigate some of those challenges that Kashyap have talked about, how the panelists have managed to overcome those challenges. With that, I'll move into just request our panelists to introduce themselves, maybe talk about themselves and the organization and the collaboration experience, and also add to your introduction what's most exciting and what's the toughest part of being part of a collaborative. I'll request Arnav to start. Arnav, if you could just talk about BMGF and what's exciting and what's the toughest part of collaborative.
Hey, thanks, Shashank, and thanks to Pradhan team, Priya team, CYST team, and the larger Bridgespan team for inviting me to join this session at Samagam 2.0. Uh, by way of introduction, I'm Arnav, and I lead Gates Foundation's philanthropic partnerships portfolio across Asia. I've been with the Gates Foundation almost 9 years now, and across various teams over the course of that duration, from healthcare, agriculture, policy, and now into the partnerships work. The work is centered on partnering with governments, philanthropies, and communities to have impact at scale. uh, to answer your question on most exciting part, I would say most exciting part of being part of philanthropic collaboration is that you get a chance to make 1 plus 1 equal to 11 happen. So that we are greater than the sum of our individual parts, and we can enable missions to scale. Um, I think the toughest part is also the same because it takes clarity, time, and alignment to make 1 plus 1 happen. But I think, as Kashyap mentioned, the payoffs outweigh any of the time constraints that go through that process. So very exciting, and I look forward to interacting with my fellow panelists and you, Shashank, over the course of the next. Thanks.
Thanks, Arnav. And interesting when you talk about 1 plus 1 is 11. I would move to Priya because I think she has, like, within the pandemic duration, she brought together a very large collaboration, and she's making that 1 plus 1 happen, like on the field. So Priya, if you could talk about what Revive is and what has been the toughest and the most exciting part.
Thank you, Shashank. It's wonderful to be here. So I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about, very briefly, about the collaboratives, and I'll talk about Revive in just a minute. So in the last 2 years, we've been part of collaboratives, including the NFSSM Alliance and the India Sanitation Coalition, and we've also started 3 collaboratives. The first one was actually a few years old now, funded by the Gates Foundation. It was a collaborative focused on water and sanitation. And then post the pandemic, there were 2 other collaboratives that we started. The first is called the India Projectors Alliance, again funded by the Gates Foundation, which had 59 funders, 56 implementation partners. We reached 5.5 million people. And just as we were kind of launching that, we set up another collaborative called Revive, which is a blended finance facility, but primarily a livelihood accelerator. Again, 25 funders, 21 partners, and partners really varying from nonprofits, MFIs, NBFCs, unicorns. A large proportion of them are private sector organizations. And even within that, we've supported 175,000 people through multiple blended finance initiatives, now scaling to 10 million, right? So I think what's been exciting is that the trust got built very, very quickly amongst a set of very unlikely partners coming together. And that was so exciting because before the pandemic, we all talked about collaboration as being a nice thing to do, and then it just became an imperative, right? People just had to work together. The second thing that was really exciting was that for the first time, there was no logos and egos conversation. Everyone was squarely focused on that migrant worker or that nurse or that person that we needed to impact and impact now, right? So the sense of urgency, very, very quick trust building, a very sharp focus on impact was, I think, very exciting. What was challenging was limited resources, multiple initiatives, lots of parallel collaboratives happening. So every morning you wake up and you say, am I doing the best I can with the limited resources I have? Am I duplicating something? Am I replicating something? So the ability to look inwards, to look at all of your partners, to look around, be constantly responsive, because there wasn't one pandemic, right? There were multiple pandemics unfolding simultaneously. And the ability to just stay focused all the time, not get distracted, I think was really a challenge, but such a great learning experience, right? Because I don't think we only learned from what we did, but we were rapidly learning from everyone else. And really initiatives like Samagam and a whole bunch of others put out a lot of information. So we constantly knew what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong, and it allowed us to course correct very rapidly.
Yeah, thanks, Priya. And you talked about the need for resources or limitations of resources, and I'll move to Yasmin, where she has been part of one of the largest collaborative efforts, philanthropic collaborative efforts. And Yasmin, if you could just talk about co-impact and what has been exciting and toughest in co-impact, because the scale at which you are trying to have collaboration is unprecedented. So
So thanks, Shashank, and thank you for just this opportunity to learn from the panel. I'm super excited to learn from the other panelists and just what's happening in the landscape in India. So quick introduction. My name is Yasmin. I'm a director of programs at Co-Impact. Co-Impact is what I think in the presentation that was given would be a funder collaborative. It's a global collaborative that has come together, started in 2017 to really invest significantly in systems change. So our foundational fund was for investing in systems change, and we recently launched the Gender Fund, which we'll capitalize to $1 billion to progress on gender equality, really move the needle on gender equality and women's leadership. And our experience so far has been that there is appetite for funders to come together to solve at scale. Just Co-Impact's experience has been we've managed to raise over 500 million so far across 45 different philanthropists and foundations across 16 countries. So it tends to be predominantly global north, but we are really working on getting global south funders as well. And the whole idea is to invest in organizations. So to me, the most exciting is this philosophy we bring, which is about our program partners. So we don't call them grantees because I think organizations are more than the funds they receive. For us, they are program partners. And our philosophy is that they're in the driver's seat, that we are at the end of the day investing in the organization that focuses on the system to solve problems for millions of people in an enduring way. And I am super excited about Gender Fund. I think if we look at outcomes across any sector today, they're gender inequitable. Women's leadership is completely significantly underrepresented, and women are not always at the table where their voices need to be heard. And so it is time to invest in gender equality around and make systems more just and inclusive. That's the exciting part. I think the challenges are that we are all on a journey, and I'm not sure it's a challenge, but it's a significant learning opportunity on how to do things when our missions and purposes are aligned, but our ways of working are different. And so I think ways of working are secondary to the purpose of organization.
So this is very interesting because you're talking about a mission alignment and how do you get the heart and the brain to sync. The hearts may sync faster when the mission alignment is there, but the brain may still say, "Hey, this is how we work." So it's great. And I'll now move to the largest funder of social development in India and a representative of that funder, which is the government. And Saurabh, the government is a key part of all collaborations in India. Like as Kashyap said, multi-stakeholder collaboratives are what are taking roots in India, and government plays a very important part. So would love to hear from you, from your previous experience, from your current experience, and over to you, Saurabh.
Thank you. First of all, a pleasure to be here. I'm Saurabh Garg. I'm presently the CEO of the Unique Identification Authority, commonly known as Aadhaar, and I have been in my present position for over a year now. And before that, for 4 years, I was heading up the Agriculture Department. I was Principal Secretary Agriculture in Orissa, where I had the opportunity of working with a number of partners and funding agencies to deliver agriculture programs for farmers. So it's always a tough journey, as I think the presentation had brought out. But I think the real good thing is seeing it all come together and seeing the impact it makes. I think that really gives a high when you have the different parts moving together with the government, with the donor, and with an implementation partner or an NGO or a knowledge partner. And of course, we can discuss of a number of programs. And as I mentioned in the past earlier also, that while the government might be funding 90 or 95% of the total program, it's that 5% which brings in the knowledge, which brings in the additional gap, so to say, and it could be in various areas. I won't go into that, but it's that I think 5% which helps to make that 95% so much more effective, and I think that's where the value is there in this partnership for everyone in it. The challenge part, I think one of the challenges for the government is obviously handling the optics of working with a number of partners. So I think that is something which we need to ensure that that the program, at least from the government's point of view, the objectives are very clear, and everyone knows that what is being brought in by the different partners, so that there are no misconceptions in that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Saurabh. And interesting, it's a great segue for the next question I have for all of you. Because you have talked about how to manage optics, but also about program design. So what I would love to learn from our panelists is what are the ingredients, what are the program design components which can help in making a collaborative a success? And what can be potential risks or pitfalls that can happen in the initial stages, in the working together stages, which can make the outcome suboptimal. And this time I'll probably start with Priya, with you, and then I'll move to Yasmin and Arnav, and then to Saurabh.
Thanks, Shashank. So, I think the first thing we learned is that the secret to collaboration is customization. That while everyone may sign off on this big vision, the reality is that every individual and every institution, whether it's a funder, an execution partner, or the government, has their set of priorities, their expectations, their limitations, right? And so, very, very early on, we learned that there isn't everyone, coming together, holding hands, signing off on this one big thing. That's not going to happen, right? And so as soon as we started customizing, whether it was for the participant and their changing needs, or our execution partners, knowing that regulation was changing, operational models were changing, everything was changing, right? Or funders who had multiple priorities and needed to focus, right? So ensuring that we were talking to each one of them every single day and saying, okay, let's customize, let's understand what you need, how can we maximize your expertise, how do we do the most with what you have, I think was integral to success. The second actually was co-creation. So I think what was very interesting is that hardly any of our funders came in and said, here's a check, go do what you want. A lot of them spoke to us every week. And I think that was the best engagement model, because we were constantly co-creating, whether it was with the execution partners or knowledge partners or funders or anybody else. So I think, ensuring that we were customizing, collaborating constantly was integral to the success of anything. We found most of our funders doubled their commitments within a few months. We're going from, a $20 million facility right now to scaling up to impact 10 million, right? 10 million workers and micro entrepreneurs. That's an order of magnitude increase. And we find that everyone has stayed committed to not just the evolving vision, but the ability to really scale up and have more ambition. So it was interesting when Kashyap was sort of talking about coming together, working together in reinvention, and saying these are three phases. That was my day, and it is my day, right? All three things are happening simultaneously. But that's been very exciting. I mean, obviously there's good days and bad days, but I really think the strength of what we learned was, how do you customize for every single individual and their needs, and how do you extract the most value out of their collaboration in a way that you're hitting, as a sector, we say sustainable. Well, it has to be sustainable in the case of a pandemic. You can't just offer something and pull it out. It doesn't work like that, right? So for the first time, we found sustainability, shared value, SDGs, like all of these things that we throw out as phrases actually being translated into real strategies. And the last thing I want to say is that I think what held it all together was trust. Everyone was going through a crisis. And I think for our execution partners to know that we had their back, for the people that we were supporting to know that we were constantly responding to their evolving needs, and for everyone to kind of trust that we were all doing the best that we could. Yes, things, slipped up, and not everyone was communicated everything the same way. But I think knowing that ultimately this was all being done in the best possible manner was, I think, kind of the key to what we experienced in the last 2 years.
That's very interesting. So, Yasmin, Priya has talked about customization as well as trust as two of the key factors, and would love to hear if your experience with philanthropists in US has been similar or different, and how.
So I think maybe the question is a combination of what are the ingredients of success as well as what resonates with
Yeah.
philanthropists, right? And I think the ingredients should be talked about first. Again, as I said, when a funders come together for a collaborative, they are secondary or tertiary. The most important issue is program partners. And I think it often that equation doesn't work like that. So I want to keep going back to it has to be about what the program partners understand that are committed to the cause and the context. And we are committed to the organizations that are committed to cause and context. So for me, the ingredients, I think one are winning coalition, which is what I think is being discussed here, which is political economy analysis. But who else will care about this when they wake up in the morning, right? We tend to bring our passion and our interest, but I think it should be infectious that who else will care about this. And that winning coalition is absolutely critical to go past windows of opportunity to I think just a steadfast investment that's needed. I think the other ingredient, very importantly, is constituency feedback. We tend to forget that, right? We tend to think about our organization, our approaches, but as much as government systems can become responsive to the people, and I think we as a role, so when we set up monitoring systems, when we set up evaluation, how is that actually building in constituency feedback so that the system is becoming more responsive rather than us generating data to show funders we had an impact or our outcomes were achieved. And I think the third ingredient is moving the focus sometimes from just the impact to actually systems level outcomes. What will change in the system in an enduring way, right? Is what matters, I think. And the last, and I think this doesn't get spoken about enough, but funders tend to pull organizations in multiple directions, and organizations lack what is called strategic coherence, right? They understand the problem, they understand what needs to be done. And so, what they need is for funders to come together to support that, to have long term funding, unrestricted as much as possible, flexible funding, and get behind it over with a learning and adaptation mindset rather than show me the outcomes mindset. I think those are the ingredients for success. And with funders, what we have to do is make sure these ingredients actually resonate with funders because they are quite blindingly obvious, I think, from a program partner.
Okay. Interesting, because you're also talking about, in a way, a diligence on the funder and not like a due diligence on operational aspect, but also belief and mindset aspect kind of due diligence for the funders may be a very important thing. And uh, Arnav, coming to you, you have been part of multiple collaboratives in India. You have brought together diverse set of funders, the government, multilaterals. Uh, how do you ensure that these very diverse set of people work together, and like what ingredients would you suggest?
Uh, Thanks, Shashank. I think first I resonate a lot with what Priya and Yasmin alluded to along the various dimensions. So I think in my perspective, I would say there are three key ingredients. First, I think spending time upfront to understand, the long-term vision, strategy, values uh, of the organizations that you're collaborating with. And like Priya said, that's like the trust building effort, uh, which takes time, but you kind of set up for success in some ways. I mean, one example I'll give is the Tribal Health Collaborative that we are partnering with the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and Ministry of Women and Child Development, and also Niti Aayog, the Pyramid Foundation, and USAID, uh, which was launched about a year back now on April 7th on World Health Day. And the larger vision of the Tribal Health Collaborative is to end preventable deaths among the tribal and marginalized communities across the 6 tribal focus states in India. So this partnership in itself, took a couple of years to come together to conceptualize. Of course, COVID delayed that process a little bit, but maybe it's actually magnified the need of working on strengthening health systems and working closely with the government on public health at large. But it takes time. It takes longer term strategy, longer term vision. and making sure that you're all starting off, with a one common approach in some ways. The second, I think, is around co-creating strategy and results framework. And like Yasmin said, it needs to be focused on systemic change and impact. We are signing up for longer term goals and kind of a bold vision in some ways. So there's one example of the Asha Kiran project that we're doing in UP with the Nudge Foundation, along with multiple philanthropies, including Aditya Birla Fiki Center for Rural Development and the UP SRLM, to support rural livelihoods, firstly on especially women, on the access to the government program schemes, and improving incomes. Secondly, by focusing and working with women farmers, primarily on backyard poultry and small ruminants. And the idea is to create more value addition, more market linkage, and increase the incomes and productivity on both ways. I think the third important point would be, I think, which was also mentioned, was to set up a strong governance model. I think it's very important that we set that up from the very beginning, and like as uh, Dr. Garg was also saying, that the objectives, the roles, responsibilities, and who's going to be doing what, and how do we then look at Emily and course correct over duration of time and scale and reinvent. I think we need to be a little bit more agile also these days on how things could and be flexible and adapt, like Yasmin was saying, because we are living in an evolving environment and the situation changes. And I think our collaboratives and partnerships will be structured towards that, right? So, for example, of course, in COVID, we had the India COVID Response Fund, which we worked with Give India, to conceptualize and set up. Uh, and along the way, I mean, as the pandemic evolved, I hope you're out of it. Uh, we were trying to focus on testing and facilities in the first wave, then pivoted to very much to oxygen in a big way during the second wave, and then finally very much focus on vaccination. But I think just generally overall, we need to have a strong governance model, uh, strong advisory committee, and course correct and take be more adaptive in how we move and be agile in making decisions. So I would say these three would be the key ingredients. Spend time upfront to create that trust, co-creation of strategy, co-creation of results framework, and third, to have a strong governance model, and then course correct as we move along.
Okay. Thanks, Arnav. And Saurabh, as the government partner in many of these collaboratives, and as like Principal Secretary Agriculture of Odisha, you were part of many of these. What are your thoughts on this question of what can make a collaboration with the government successful? From the government angle, what is it that, let's say, if I'm coming to you with a proposal, what should I think through before I come to you, and what is it that I should be working with you?
Yeah, thank you. I think a number of the issues that my co-panelists have mentioned, I would totally agree with them. But if I would pick up a few, I would number one say is the clarity on the objectives that each partner is bringing to the table. Uh, I think the government has the ability to work at scale, but where the Samaj comes in is, for example, in the community connect, or in the ability to develop relationships with a lot of the customers to a level which is very different from the government can ever do it. Similarly, if you look at the donors, the kind of knowledge that they can bring to the table, or the gaps that exist in any program that are there. So if there's a clarity on objectives on what each person is bringing to the table, it automatically makes it a win-win kind of coalition for everyone concerned. And on the government aspect also, on the government side, they need to realize that where is it that they are lacking, and what is the skills or what are the gaps that they're looking. So that's number one. Second is, which is equally important, is that whatever is decided, it meets the objectives of each of the individual partners. Because, as was mentioned, I think by Priya Nayak, who mentioned about the logos and egos. So I think the objectives of each of the partner in coming onto the table also needs to be clear. because the optics of that is very important when we are talking of the government, and especially given the fact that we are much more focused on the issues related to audits, whether it's social audit or public audit. And along with this is the issue that the government, the processes are as important as the outcomes itself. And that becomes very often an issue with many partners who might be more focused on outcomes very logically, but in the government, processes are all are as important also. So I think that objectives of each of the partners is very important. And and the third part which I would put equally, is the fact that uh, uh, that which is more for the government, that the program objectives which have been laid out initially remain the same through the course. There might be course corrections in terms of the implementation, but
Mhm.
program objectives need to remain the same. Otherwise, we get into issues of optics of why the program objectives got changed. So I would say that while the vision might remain the same, you might have changes in the tactics and implementation strategies, etc. But it's very important that the communication of the broad vision remains the same through the program.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I'll change track a little. And Saurabh, in your current role, you're heading UIDAI. And I just wanted to like spend some time how this tech backbone that has been created in India. When we talk about that being available, how can collaboration happen which can integrate this tech backbone, and like what is it that the funders, the philanthropists, and NGOs should be thinking about how to leverage it better?
Yeah, I think the digital India is that how the digital mechanism or digital India can help in the ease of living of people. And I think that's the flagship or the flag or the broad message. Within that, let's look at, for example, the digital identity infrastructure, which is Aadhaar, which right now 99.9% of the adults have an Aadhaar. I think in the presentation initially it was mentioned about the 1.39 billion people. 1.33 have an Aadhaar in the country, and all above the age of 18. So the attempt, for example, is to enable how it can be used by different partners by means of a QR code so that everyone can use it, how a person can voluntarily use it to identify themselves. And that itself is very, very empowering if you are able to say who I am and you don't have to, no one is questioning that. So I think the use of the digital identity infrastructure in various methods for the ease of living is something that we are working on. We are working even now with partners to see what needs to be done to enable that tech. The second, if I can just to take a few examples, because the second is, for example, the GIS and the satellite-based technology infrastructure, which exists with the NRSC, with the ISRO, and which is again available for anyone to use. I think that's another infrastructure that we can really leverage for in a variety of measures to implement programs, and again it is available for all to use at virtually no cost or at no cost, depending on how it is used. And the third, which I think a lot of organizations, especially we're talking about the Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar on the Samaj side, is on how to use technology for monitoring, how to use technology for audit, how to use technology for performance, and I think a lot of those technologies are available. On the public, they're all public goods, many of them, and how they can be used is something which through developing apps, APIs, which can be used on any smartphone. I think those are the kind of issues that Digital India is working on, with the objective that at least in the government, that whatever delivery of services can be done digitally should be done, especially because you have the BharatNet program, which is enabling availability of internet at the village level. more than 90% is already accessible through the BharatNet optic fiber program, 90% of the country. And the second is the telecom revolution, where even now more than two-thirds of the phones are smartphones, which even a few years back was less. So it's going to take some more time before everyone has a smartphone, but the way technology and the penetration is happening, that day also doesn't seem to be. So how a smartphone can become the means for empowerment across the country, I think that's something we need to leverage much more.
Thanks, Saurabh. And one thing that the pandemic has really done is for us as the social sector, it has sort of compelled us to leverage technology more than what we were earlier willing to do. And what I hear you say is we need to look at technology as an accelerant. It can be an accelerant in terms of identification, it can be an accelerant in terms of creating accountability, it can be an accelerant in terms of delivery as well. And that's what we should be thinking about when we are talking about our programs. I think we have talked a lot about what we need to do in the collaboratives. And I think at the same time, there are trade-offs that have to be made. Trade-offs that have to be made at individual stakeholder level. And Arnav, I'll probably start with you to just understand that when it comes into collaboration, and all of you have talked about like aligning on mission and a lot of like ways of working, as Yasmin also talked about. Like what kind of trade-offs have to be made, and how do you create a buy-in amongst the internal stakeholders? Like anything that we can learn from BMGF will be useful. Arnav, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, still learning to go off mute after being in 2 years. So I was just saying that our thinking, and the work is very much aligned in working with partnerships, and collaboratives with the government, philanthropies, private sector communities, writ large. So it's quite aligned. I mean, more broadly. So I don't think there is that much of internal stakeholder expectation management that one may have to do. I think we look at it in probably two buckets, right? Impact at scale across the priority areas that the Gates Foundation works in. I think we look for alignment in those areas and where we can, add value. Uh, whether it's try to understand priorities, of the partners themselves, right? So in case of the government, try to understand the gaps and the priorities where we can be helpful. Are there innovations that we can bring in? Are there best practices, technical, uh, you know, support that we could bring in? I think then working with the implementation organizations to understand from them, since they're much closer to the ground, on what are the gaps and challenges on the ground where we could support, and then working with philanthropies, in kind of creating that multi-stakeholder with the government communities and the philanthropies themselves to make sure that we are working both in terms of top down, bottoms up in some ways, to reach at the right goal, or the goal that the program objectives, as Dr. Garg said, we've signed up for at the beginning. The second is to probably, I would say, just grow the field and have broader impact on SDGs, whether it's around strategic philanthropy at large or looking at innovations uh, more broadly. I think, we sometimes take a slightly more wider canvas. And also, depending on the context and the issue, we could help in seeding some kind of sometimes collaboratives or scaling collaboratives. But that would depend on again the context and issue. I mean, in terms of a trade-off, I would say that we've I think, like I said before, it to build that consensus, you need to start upfront and get to know, spend time to understand and build that alignment. So I think that's probably one. I think second is to make sure that we probably cede some control. I think in some cases, which we are very much learning and evolving, and so I think I don't know that I don't think so that we have the answers to anyways to any to everything. We might have some ideas, but I think to ceding that control to the larger communities, to the organizations is very much important since they are much closer to the ground. And I think third, I would just say that you know, things would evolve and would, uh, can, the context could evolve, right? So sometimes it takes slightly more time, also from an implementation, standpoint, given that it's multi-stakeholder, right? So, but then I would say that, what the impact we could have achieved ourselves without a collaborative would have been much lower than working with, with a larger, wider group, because I think we'll amplify the impact and the scale of what we'll be able to achieve. So it pays off in that sense. But I would think those are some of the broader points. But I think writ large we're very much aligned, and our thesis is to work in partnerships and collaboratives with the multi-stakeholder perspective.
Sorry, interesting. And Yasmin, you manage, like, you're managing programs for a large collaborative where funders are external stakeholders as well as part of the collaborative. So as being part of the backbone organization, like, what kind of trade-offs do you see that funders typically have to make? And
So, one, I just want to clarify, we don't manage programs, right? We support programs. They are managed by the organizations, very much so. I think we are also aware that we are a funder collaborative, investing oftentimes in collaboratives. For instance, we are today investing in the Migrant Resilient Collaborative in the country. And from our side, what we encourage is revisiting the problem analysis. I think I completely agree with the Arnav and others that alignment around goals matters, but I do think taking a moment to revisit the problem analysis and agreeing on what's being solved, particularly in the systems level, mapping systems actors, and thinking slightly outside the collaborative as well to what's the evolving role of the collaborative, which is important. I just wanted to bring that up. But the trade-off as funders, I think, is the ability to sometimes design or programs or request for outcomes that are aligned with the funder, right? Is very much about the why do we fund it and what do we fund. And I think if you shift the focus to how we fund, which is all these values that I've talked about, then the trade-offs don't seem that much. For instance, Co-Impact would say we fund in health. Now, we won't go on to say whether that's maternal mortality or family planning. We would leave that to the program partners to decide what they've been working on, what's the most pressing issue in that context, and where there are windows of opportunity to solve that at scale in partnership with others. And I think that means letting go of what we know and trusting what our partners know. And I think that's one big trade-off. The second is, I think we have to acknowledge a power dynamic. I think the person who brings the check holds a certain power today, but sometimes all they hold is a check, right? I don't think they necessarily hold an understanding of the problem. They don't hold the ability to get on the ground and rally everybody together. And so I think acknowledging a power dynamic and then letting go of it is a journey for all organizations, but particularly for funders. And that's important. And then I think the point sort of made, which I completely agree with, looking at what is that value add of philanthropic funding, right? Is it here to stay, or is it here to actually be a catalytic to unlock much larger funding that governments or private sector can bring? And so knowing when to come in and knowing when to leave, I think, is something that is a consideration. And then it becomes a trade-off for funders as well. And how do you balance that with long-term commitment to something? So these, we don't have answers, but I agree with Arnav. I think these are things we grapple with together. The commitment to partnerships and collaboration and to our program partners is high. And so I think this grappling is completely worth it and part of the journey.
thanks, Yasmin. And Priya, I'll come to you, and when you answer, I would love to also learn from you about this power dynamics that Yasmin has talked about. When these multiple stakeholders come together in one collaborative, how does that power dynamics play out, and like how do you manage it as the people who are effectively the glue of bringing everyone together?
Yeah, so I completely agree with Yasmin, right? I think the magic of a collaborative is to at all points and say, who are we doing this for? And who are we doing this with, right? The people you're doing this with have to be clear about who we're doing this for at all points in time. And I think we got incredibly lucky because across all of our collaboratives, and I think the Gates Foundation was one of the first ones to come in and said, let's invest in monitoring, evaluation, and learning, where the voice of the person that you're looking to impact is central to any decision making. And we, for example, have a separate monitoring, evaluation, and learning team. They're completely unbiased. And what they do consistently is actually bubble up what's happening on the ground. And we're all responsible for constantly responding to those evolving needs, but also requests and partnership models, etc. Right? So one of the first things that we hold ourselves accountable to is not just efficacy, but also responsiveness. So we've had under Revive, participants come back and say, like 98% of them have said, we love this. This was customized for our needs. It was delivered the way we wanted it to be delivered. It helped us at a time when we needed it the most. And so for me, it's a very, very critical indicator, and one that in some sense helps address a lot of the other power dynamics. I'll just give you a quick example, right? And when you ask about trade-offs and responsibilities. So when we first started Revive, Omidyar and MSTF were the first funders. They came in and supported a new instrument called a returnable grant. A returnable grant, very simply, is a zero interest, zero collateral, pay if you can grant. Functions like a loan, but it's not a loan, right? It's a moral obligation to repay. Why was a returnable grant important? Because a large proportion of people were impacted. Think of them as workers, micro entrepreneurs. There was no money in the system. And so we used philanthropic capital to say, here's money, get yourselves up and running, pay it back, we can help somebody else, right? This was going swimmingly well. And then came in USAID and FCDO and UNDP and 25 other corporate funders. The 3 other foundations who came in as anchor funders said, we love returnable grants. Sorry, our government policies don't allow us to participate. And so what could have been like a, oh my God moment, like we're not seeing alignment, actually became a very interesting moment because we said, great. Some people can fund grants, some can do returnable grants, some can do low interest debt, some can create a credit guarantee. Now I have a blended finance continuum, the right product for the right organization and the right individual. Then came in, Google, LinkedIn, Microsoft, and said, love finance, we care about digitization, integral to the success and of all of these informal workers and entrepreneurs. Could have been another oh my God moment. Now we said, fantastic. In addition to financial inclusion, let's bring in digitization. Then came in 3 other funders who said, by the way, social security, very, very important. We said, great, now let's layer in social security, right? So what could have been, a mechanism where the power dynamics could have limited what we do, in some sense, the fact that each funder had priorities, but also restrictions, allowed us to say all of it together, blended, layered on top of each other. So everyone does their bit. We leverage each other's competence and interests and networks, but we bring it all together, right? And I mean, I must say that, technology played such a stunning role. The one thing that happened in COVID is that everyone was on their mobile phone, right? And so the ability to even think of scale, to think of many partners, many interventions, many participants, many instruments, lots of innovation, that was not possible 2 years ago, very much became possible. And I feel like, I know we talk about collaboratives as being distinct, but there's something that happens to the ecosystem. Without Aadhaar, there is no way that we could have done what we did. And there is no way that we can build an ambition to say we're going to impact 10 million people, we're going to commit to increasing incomes of farmers and artisans and Uber drivers, right? That level of diversity and inclusion would not have been possible if Aadhaar had not done what it did, or if the government had not created the Bharat Stack, right? Or if other collaboratives hadn't built trust and comfort at scale. If our execution partners didn't have the capacity, which funders actually paid for over the last 2 years, none of this would have been possible. So I think I just want to end by saying, I know that we are always thinking about our collaboratives, but the fact that the field got built by funders like Gates and Co-Impact and the others, and they did it at scale, and they did it across multiple organizations. It was sort of this concept of rising ships, right? Everyone benefited and everyone learned from each other, which I thought was, such a phenomenal success of the last 2 years. And I guess my hope from now on is to say, can we take that trust and the networks and the core capabilities and build on that very robust foundation? Because hopefully we're no longer reacting. We have the ability to step back and say what has happened, what's worked, what hasn't, and then really build the foundational elements that are going to be critical to deliver this at scale.
Yeah. So Priya, every time you talked about the oh my God moment, I felt this is a great Abda Mein Afsar story. Right? Every time there was an Abda, you created an opportunity. So thanks for sharing your experience. And I know we are short on time. So what I'll do is probably maybe I'll just request Priya to you to just like you touched briefly about a lot of collaborative built during the crisis, and what's the future? Is it something that will continue, or is it something that you feel that the urgency is not no longer going to be there, and we may shift back to the business as usual approach? And then probably sort of like, is there an active interest from the government for further convergence and collaboration? And then we'll open it for the questions.
Yeah, so Shashank, I think I'm very, very optimistic. I'm an optimistic person, so that helps, right? But I feel like we've gone from the let's react to a crisis madness to now saying, hey, wait a minute, collaboration really works. It didn't just work for Samhita, it worked for many, many other partners, right? So I feel like funders have a lot more confidence. A lot of the social organizations are feeling that collaboratives don't necessarily interfere with who they are. Like, it's actually good for them. We've seen, the stellar work that Britspan has done to really kind of bubble up the knowledge, the insights, right, and build confidence. So I feel like a lot of the trust elements, the capacity building elements, the foundational challenges that all of us were daunted by 2 years ago are no longer there. And so how do we use this moment of hopefully brief calm before something else happens to now kind of step back, exchange notes, say what worked, what didn't. And if you have to build back again, or if you have to build something new again, I think there is a lot of insights and experiences and relationships. And I'm really confident that this is a good time to sort of build far more thoughtfully, right? And collaboratively, like never before. So I'm very optimistic. And I really believe that we can do this right. We can do this at scale. We can do it by addressing the power dynamics. We can build a governance mechanism. We can actually leverage each other's strengths. We don't have to compete. But I feel like this has become almost the new way and a good way to do things. So I'm very, very optimistic.
Thanks, Priya. And Saurabh, like government has always been big on convergence and collaboration, but like, has the pandemic further accelerated that thought process, or how has been the reaction to further collaboration on the government side?
Um, I mean, as you would realize, I mean, government is not one monolithic. It's a sum of many parts. So, but I would say that uh, I think everyone realizes that collaborations would help to make any program much more sustainable and much more with a greater longevity. What kind of collaboration is possible or needed in a different might vary. It could be, for example, in the formulation of the program where there is a lot of vagueness, if I can put it that way. It could be in terms of the community connect, which I mentioned in some. In some, it could be on what kind of linkages with the market that is needed. For example, a lot of products need that. It could be in terms of impact assessment and analysis, the evaluation monitoring that is done. It could be in terms of the communication strategy, the IEC mechanism. So I would say that perhaps there is no one method or one area where that collaboration might be needed. It could be one or many of these, or all of these. It could be, but I think the issue would be to able to understand, and I think that that's going to come collaboratively and with the knowledge of everyone, that what is the biggest pain point in a particular program or in a particular area or sector, and addressing that biggest pain point, which will only improve the effectiveness of the program. I think that realization is there. Obviously, getting all the actors together is a big problem, but I think that's why everyone is out here to try and figure out how that can be done best.
Thanks, Saurabh. And I'll pick questions, and if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to add in the chat as well. And while people can type questions, Arnav, Yasmin, any reaction to what Priya and Saurabh have talked about? Anything on like your perspective on the future?
Okay, maybe I can jump in. I think, like Priya said, I'm personally quite optimistic. I think the foundation is also quite optimistic about it. And I think also wanted to call out that collaboratives were there before COVID too, right? So if you look at it in BC, which was before COVID, assuming that we are now after COVID, though that's the case is rising again. So you never know. But even before COVID, there was the India Climate Collaborative, the National Fecal Research Management Alliance, India Sanitation Coalition, that's the Adolescent Collaborative, which was there, right? So it's been happening over the last, I would say, 7 to 8 years, if not before. During COVID, there was a COVID has emerged as an inflection point, but we saw many new funds coming in. India COVID Response Fund, ACT Fund. Priya spoke about the India Projectors Alliance. There was also RCRC, which was very unique with more than 50 plus implementing organizations which came together to work on the grassroots. And then even right now, we are currently, even if I call it after COVID, so right before and during and after, Eagle Give Foundation, if I recall, they've launched the Grow Fund. Give India's launched the Bharat EdTech Alliance. Priya Samhita, they're leading the work on Revive. There are also global collaboratives, both Maverick, Co-Impact. Yasmin spoke about both the Gender Fund and the Systems Impact work. And they're also, we're also seeing new models of philanthropy and collaboratives, such as the Young India Philanthropic Pledge. So all of these are kind of shaping, and aiming to inspire large-scale collaborative philanthropy. And I think all of this just makes me optimistic, that this could only hold well for the future of philanthropy and growth impact in India.
Sure. Thanks, Arnav. And okay, so I'll take a question. Kashyap, I'll direct the question to you. But if anyone wants to add anything, it'll be okay. So the question that Sumedha has asked is why conducting research and development is not an area of focus for collaboration, and are there any specific reasons that we have identified in our conversations, in our research?
Yeah, so I think it's a good observation, and I there are two parts to it. I think the first part is, if you see in the social landscape itself, the number of actors working on research and development, I think, are limited. And in a way, that translates into the collaboratives as well, because the collaboratives are nothing but actors coming together. So I think that's one key reason in terms of dearth of number of actors doing R&D related work. Second is, I think, for a lot of resource constrained NGOs and other frontline actors, I think asking funders to invest in promising but unproven ideas can be little. I think it's safer for NGOs to solicit funds for legacy programs that work. So here we are talking about a new or relatively new model of collaboration, and I think within that the initial preference is to go with programs which might work or which are more around implementation or facilitating implementation or channelizing funding compared to the research and development aspect. But I think going forward, I think we can definitely, as more and more collaboratives get established, funders get comfortable, we can definitely see collaborators doing R&D kind of work as well. So optimistic on that, but I feel the pace of that would be a bit slow, at least for the next some months or couple of years.
Thanks, Kashyap. And Priya, there was a specific question for you in terms of when you're forming a collaborative. Like when you talked about customization, you talked about integrating inputs from different partners, and like when the collaborative model is being devised, do you also create processes, protocols, do's and don'ts?
Yeah, so that's integral to the collaborative, right? Because unless there is a clear governance structure, roles and responsibilities, I mean, for example, when we rolled out the returnable grant, we worked with a wide variety of partners: Pratham, Tissar, Seva, Mandeshi, M-Swipe, Snapbase, right? I mean, no two organizations were the same. No two organizations were using funding in the same way. And so, in some sense, you want to have basic SOPs, but you also want to customize for the needs of each partner and cohorts. So, yeah, I think, and we've, like I said, the three collaboratives, right? One is the WASH work that we've done with the Gates Foundation and the NFSSM Alliance and ISC. And the model was very different from the India Projectors Alliance, which was very much kind of responding to the here and now, very different from Revive, where we said we want to take people who've been excluded from the formal financial ecosystem, who are basically informal, and how do you move them towards formalization? So you're thinking systems from the beginning, you're collaborating with banks and NBFCs and a whole bunch of other players. And so the actors are different, the processes are different, the models are different. And so we're trying to kind of write up a playbook, but we're realizing that it's actually quite different. And I think the work that you've done in terms of documenting the collaboratives has been exceptional, right? So I almost feel like, this is something that we need to do collectively, but also with players such as yourselves, because a lot of times, we're very tactical, right? What's happening today, I mean, you sometimes break the process because things have changed. Whereas actually doing it with a partner like you holds us accountable to saying what's unique to Samhita versus what's different and what's unique to collaboratives in general. So yes, I think we have a lot of documentation and a lot of creation, but I feel like it's also good to do it at an ecosystem level so we can all collectively learn about what's similar and what's different.
Thanks, Priya. And just going back to the research question, Yasmin, as you pointed out, you invest in program partners, and it's for the program partners to decide how to best create impact. So the question for you would be like, is research and development an area where global collaborators, large scale collaborators also focus on, or is it something that's not that much a focus for global collaborators either?
No, definitely. So if you take the gender fund as an example, right, the gender fund that Co-Impact has set up, I think we're investing in research in two different ways. One is as part of the initiatives that we support, the partners will decide what research they want to do, but obviously at outcome level, but as well as part of the learning agenda, right? For us, learning, monitoring, and evaluation are all combined, and the partners get to set that agenda on it. The second is, in addition, gender actually, surprisingly, there are significant gender data gaps. I think sometimes a basic visibility on gender data does not exist, as well as a deeper understanding of some of the drivers of gender exclusion and disparities. And so we are also investing in independent research studies to fill some of those gender data gaps, to understand what works or what are some of the what we call these boulders, right? What keeps millions of women out of achieving and fulfilling their lives that the way it should be, whether it's on health, education, economic opportunity. We see gaps in understanding some of the root causes, so we're investing in that as well.
Thanks.
I
Yes.
just wanted to come in on another interesting aspect that actually came across during our research. And in this context of research and development, I think there are two important parameters when we talk about R&D, right? One is patience and the ability to risk failure. And in some sense, while the first part of my answer was a bit more cynical on why it has not happened, but the second part of what I'm just going to say is about how collaboratives can actually be antidote to do more of R&D kind of work, because simply the exposure to that risk of failing divides or gets divided. And there can be therefore a more fruitful mechanism to pursue rather than individual organizations doing that. So I definitely see that hope, and that's the reason I felt that it can pick up in future for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Kashyap, and I'll take just two more questions. So the first question is, Arnav, I'm directing it to you. I'm just pushing you in a corner here. There's this question of small NGOs and FPOs need support on common services like MIS services, accounting services, and many of these larger civil society organizations have been able to build, but building at a smaller scale is suboptimal. So is there like any thought process going around in the funder community on setting up a collaborative which is at that kind of operational nature? So that will be good to learn.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shashank. I think this is, a definite need which has been spoken about in the past also. I would say, there have been two or three efforts. I think one would be that, uh, a shared services model. This has been discussed, in the past. I think it needs to be tested out and see how it would work, and to the needs of the various organizations. Uh, it's not been fructified, I think, over the last 2 3 years, but there's been some discussions around that. I think second, through funds like the Grow Fund, they are providing some bit of support on these elements to the various organizations. On capacity building, on finance and MIS and so forth. But I think it's a good input, something we've grappled with in the past, and totally recognize the need that we need to look at it in a much more larger uh, scale and scheme of things. And we are, I mean, we would definitely see and encourage if we can work with other funders and the implementing organizations and with intermediaries and everyone to see if that could be, there could be some kind of a mechanism set up which could help, because it unnecessarily takes time and effort to do, and takes it your for focus away from some of the impacts sometimes. So yeah, I mean, I'll take it as an input, but there are a couple of things which we've discussed and happened, but I think the more needs to be done.
Yeah, thanks, Arnav. And I think we are at time, almost at time. Uh, I'm just trying to go through questions. There are two levels. So there was this question of at what level collaboration needs to be formed to leave an impact at scale, large, since it needs a long-term perspective and vision to pursue it together. So Yasmin, I'll direct this to you and just like fine tune it to say, like, is collaborative a top-down process? Is it like you align the principles of philanthropic organizations and that's how it will flow, or is it like you work with people who are working with CSOs and then move up? How do you create a large-scale collaborative?
No, first, I think this panel, the examples the speakers have shared, and the research that Bridgespan brought to the table, I think answers that question. That collaboratives can happen in multiple ways. They can be bottom up, which is, I think, a fantastic way, and Priya gave us excellent examples of that. And in response to a need, but larger than the immediate problem, right? There was a systemic sort of response to what needs to be done. I think they can happen laterally, because organizations are working in an ecosystem and they realize that the problem is bigger than the organization and its approach, and there's a need to come together. And Arnav, I think, shared some excellent examples of that, of really shifting things around in certain sectors. And I wouldn't call it top down. I want to be careful, because what happens is when we visually use these terms, we put donors on top, and we call them implementing our agencies, which is another thing. There's so much more than that, right? To me, these are organizations committed to cause and context, I have to say. So it's not top down, but I do think there is a role for funder collaboratives. I absolutely think there is a role for that. And I think there is a role for collaboratives that don't have funders. So I would say, I hope this activity, this energy, this optimism continues, and we just have every permutation combination of collaboratives possible. And as usual, I think the innovation as well as the scale of problem and effort in India will be path breaking for others to learn from.
Thanks, Yasmin, and I'll close. We are already 2 minutes behind, so I'll close the session here. And I just wanted to thank all of you for making time, spending 1.5 hours with us. Yasmin, a special thanks, and more than you, I would want to thank your program partners, because we have taken 1.5 hours away, like from them for you to be here. So thank you. And thank you, Dr. Saurabh Garg. It was really interesting to learn the government perspective and how things work. Thanks, Arnav. Thanks, Priya. Thanks, Kashyap. And a very big thanks to all the audience members. Thank you, and see you in the next session.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Shashank, for this outstanding session with such a talented bunch of panelists. So much to hear, so much to listen, and so much to absorb from each one of you who spoke during the last 90 odd minutes. In fact, when we began the morning today, Shokun Noda, who was our first keynote speaker, the first thing that she said was that if India achieves the Sustainable Development Goals, the world achieves SDGs. So, the day began with India, and also Yasmin in her concluding remark. I think that was a concluding remark of this highly invigorating 90 minutes. She also ended with this India story that if India learns to collaborate, then the world learns to collaborate better. So couldn't have been a greater start and a greater sort of conclusion to this. I just want to thank you, Shashank, and all the esteemed panelists for coming together and sharing your insights, your ideas, how your experiences, your learnings, and giving us hope and optimism to each one. I think what also stood through in this last whatever 75, 80 odd minutes is the sense of optimism and hope that all of you are bringing to the table. So thank you so much for that. I think we will end it here at this point of time and reassemble in. So we'll take a short break. We will get back again together at 3:30 for our third and last session of the day before we come to the takeaway session. So thank you so much, Shashank, once again for brilliantly hosting this session. Thank you.